So, what we have today is, we got our lesson on, we left off last time on, at the time Paul was having a trial with Festus and Agrippa, the two leaders of Judea. And what he said was that they realized that Paul hadn't done anything wrong. If you look at that Acts chapter, at that Acts verse that I have up here from Acts 26, they said, then Agrippa said to Festus, this man might have been set free if he had not appealed to Caesar. So they knew he hadn't committed any crimes, but he did appeal to Caesar. And so what he's going to do is they're going to go to Rome and talk to Nero, the Caesar. So what I have down here is that Paul had always intended to go to Rome. If you look on when he was on the third missionary journey, if you look at that passage from Ephesus that I have there, he said that after he had passed through Greece, after I have been there, I must also see Rome. And later, he was still on the missionary journey, the third one, and people believe that he wrote the book of Romans from Corinth on the third missionary journey, and he told the Romans that this is why I'm so eager to preach the gospel also to you who are at Rome. So he knew he was going to go there eventually. In another place in Romans, he said that he was going to go to Spain. So if you look at verse 24 there, he said, since I've been longing for many years to see the Romans, I plan to see them when I go to Spain. We don't know if he ever got to Spain. A lot of people think he did. It's not in the Bible. But the thing is that he said he was going to visit them and have them help him with his journey to Spain. So it was God's will that Paul end up in Rome, because he wanted Paul to preach in the capital of the entire empire. And we're not going to get to the imprisonment in Rome today, but I'm sure that Dennis will talk about the fact that Paul was chained to a Roman prisoner, to a Roman official from the Praetorium, and every single one of them heard the gospel, probably a couple hundred. So this was a huge thing for the leaders to get the gospel. Now, so the thing is though, after Paul appealed to Caesar, even though they didn't want to send him, Agrippa said he has to go to Rome. So the first thing I have here is Acts 27. It says that it was decided that when we should sail to Italy, who's the we? See, this is Luke writing Acts, correct? Well, Luke is with Paul, and he had probably been with him during the imprisonment also. So he says that this is what happened before they left. They delivered Paul and some other prisoners to Julius, who was a centurion of the Augustan regiment. The Augustan regiment was the imperial regiment. They're like the SS in Nazi Germany. They're like the highest ranking Marines that protect the president in wartime. That was who these people were, but this was probably named after Augustus. Caesar was the first Caesar, and probably this was a special detachment that handled prisoners. And so the fact that they were using the most prestigious soldiers to transport Paul and the other prisoners showed they thought that was a very important thing to get these people to Rome. The thing is, the rest of the prisoners were probably going to be executed, but Paul was not, because He didn't do anything wrong. Now, the next part of this is the ship that they went on. Luke traces the entire journey to Rome. Why did he spend so much of the time in Acts on just the journey and the shipwreck? He could have just said they got to Rome. Nobody knows. The Holy Spirit told him to do it, of course. But the thing is that it's a way of this was the best explanation I heard. This was a way of showing Paul's leadership. People had to trust him for 2,000 years from that point on. And on this journey, he really became the leader of the ship, even. And it would show what a great leader he was during this journey. And you're going to find that out as we go. Yes, sir.
Mark, there's 2 of those ships up at Gunnersville now, if anybody wants to go up there and see
Oh,
them.
really? They have them? Yeah.
That's the Nina and the Pinta or something.
Oh, right, yeah.
But I'm sure it'd be similar to what they use.
Yeah, it would have been similar, definitely. Now, the thing is that they didn't take, though, the ship they used to go to Rome first. It says in Acts that entering a ship of Adramyttium, that was a city, that was an area near the coast. And what they did was, and it says that Aristarchus is with them. Adramyttium is on the coast, and what the person did was pick a big, slow boat that only went along the coast first. And so that was what they started with. Aristarchus is an important person. You know, Luke was probably Paul's doctor, but Aristarchus might have been his, attendant to help him with whatever he needed. And he's mentioned in Colossians by Paul as a fellow prisoner. Well, this imprisonment might have been voluntary because he was going to be the one that attended Paul. There's no evidence that Aristarchus did anything wrong. So these 2 people were with Paul. Now, in Acts 27:3, they started the journey. So they started in Caesarea, and they landed in Sidon. And the person on the ship, like Paul, he wasn't a criminal. So they let him go and get provisions on land from the friends of his. They trusted him to come back, obviously, and he did. So Paul got the provisions together for the journey. Now, the next couple verses talk about where they went first, and I want to show you. It said they started from Caesarea, which is, of course, in Israel, and they went to Sidon, and then they passed by the 2 places, Cyprus and Pamphylia. They said the reason they went past Cyprus was to protect them from the wind, because it was really stormy. And that was the foreshadowing of the entire journey, because the whole journey was going to be just one storm after another. So they traveled through using Cyprus and ended up in this city called Myra. Myra was a very important city at the time. It was a grain storage place, and it was a port. And so this was where ships oftentimes stopped on the way to Rome. So it wasn't unusual to stop there. But what the centurion did then was he found an Alexandrian ship sailing to Italy. And because the ship they had was not really suitable for open water, there was no way they were going to get to Rome in this big, huge ship that he had started with. So these ships are unbelievable. It was huge. It says later in Acts, and we're going to see the passage, that these ships carried 276 passengers. I've read things that say that they could it could carry possibly as many as 600 people. That is a huge boat, and they also put stores of grain on the boat. So this was a huge ship. According to the history that I read, the size of these Alexandrian ships was never exceeded, so that they made bigger ships until the 18th century AD. So even the Nina and Pinta Santa Maria would have been small, as equal or smaller than this ship.
They're tiny.
They're tiny. This was not tiny. This was a huge, gigantic ship with lots of people on it. And the next slide is this is what they look like. They had rudders and anchors, of course, to steer with and to stop. And then there's different pictures. There could be one mainsail and a smaller one in the back, or there could be a series of them, but they were huge ships, and sometimes they had images of gods on the front and back. So this one was a color one I found. I don't know if this is an actual, this looks like a replica, modern replica, that's actually sailing. So this is what those ships look like. They were huge. And so this is what he sailed on. Now, what it says in Acts is that they had some trouble. It said that they were sailing for many days, very slowly. They were trying to get to this island Nidus, and the wind was against them. They sailed under the shelter of Crete off Salome. I want to show a picture of where this is, because Crete is a very familiar island. It's in the middle of the Mediterranean Sea. What they did was they tried to sail from Myra. They used Rhodes as a shield from the wind, and then they tried to get to Nidus, which is right here. And because of the wind, it was so bad, they didn't try to go along the coast. They went to Crete. And here's Salome, which they tried to get around, and it said they got around very difficult, and ended up at a place called Fair Havens. That was the name of the city they stopped at. It was a port on the south side of Crete. This is the place where Paul warned them, do not sail anywhere else. Because if you sail anywhere else, you are going to get in big trouble because of the weather. But of course, Paul's not a ship person. So what the centurion, who's the captain, and the owner of the ship was with him, and also the person called the helmsman, who was a professional sailor, they all said, we don't want to spend the winter in Fair Haven. Fair Haven was not a good port to spend the winter in. It was horrible. It was on the south of Crete. What they wanted to do was they wanted to get to a place called Phoenix. Now, you know, I'd rather spend the winter in Phoenix than just about anywhere, except it's not that Phoenix. This is Phoenix on the very edge of Crete, and it's only 40 miles from where they were, Fair Havens. And they're like, why shouldn't we sail just 40 miles and get to this much better port, which was open to the sea? It would have been way better to stay the winter there. Now, how do you know it was the winter? Well, the passage says that it says that the fast was already over. The fast they're talking about is the Jewish Day of Atonement, where the priest goes and offers the blood in the most holy place only once a year. That was the Day of Atonement. And after that time, it was almost impossible to sail because of the weather. And this was in September or October. So winter was coming. And Paul said, this ship is going to be destroyed if you sail. And an angel told me that, but of course, they're not into that. They don't, they're pagans. So what they decided to do was, they said, it's only 40 miles away, we're gonna go to the better port. So that's what they tried to do. And so, the owner of the ship wanted to go, so that's where they went. Now, the thing is that right at the right time, the wind kind of calmed down also. And it started to blow from the south, which is what they needed to get to Phoenix. So they set sail. And almost right away, it says, not long after, a tempestuous headwind arose called the Euroclydon. That is a combination of Greek and Roman words that means a northeaster. You know, this is the sailor stuff. Nor'easter blowing up. It's coming from the northeast, which is the exact opposite of what they wanted, because they wanted to have an east wind that blew a little bit north, because that's where Phoenix was. So when they started, they were immediately blown south, and they could not fight the wind. They couldn't get to Phoenix because the wind was fighting them. And if you look at this map, they were only 40 miles away, but the wind started to blow them south. And they tried to get, yes? Oh. It's off? I don't know, I have no idea. There we go. Okay, so they, what happened, they used this island, Clauda, again, as a protectant, but it didn't help, because the wind was so strong, they ended up getting blown south. And if you look at this passage, they were scared. It's that after running that shelter of that island, they wrapped cords around the bottom of the ship all the way around, because they knew they were going to end up in a really bad storm and they wanted to strengthen it. And they also pulled in what's called the skiff. It's a small boat. It's not really a lifeboat, but it's a smaller boat that they were pulling. And that boat you could take excursions on with just a few people. But they wanted to save it, so they brought it into the main ship. It says in the passage that they were afraid lest they run aground on the Syrtis sands. And I looked up where this is, and that is in northern Africa. They were so afraid that the wind was so bad that they were going to get blown all the way from where they were to Africa, which is a very long trip, but they didn't know where the wind was going to drag them, because they just couldn't control the wind. And then they started to throw stuff off the ship. They lightened the ship. Even the ship's tackle they started throwing off. And the other thing about this, it says that neither sun nor stars appeared for many days. How did you navigate in that day and age?
Stars.
By the stars and by the sun and by the moon. They had no idea where they were. All they knew is they were getting blown by a tempest in some direction that was way south of where they wanted to go. And they were truly in bad shape. So they even took some of the sails down because they didn't want to run into Africa, believe it or not. That's how scared these people were. Now, but Paul this is where he stepped in as a very good leader. The first thing he says in Acts 27:21 is, men, you should have listened to me. What is, how many times have you said that to somebody? I told you, but you just won't listen. You should have listened to me. So they didn't. And he said, you wouldn't have had all these problems. But he said, now I urge you to take heart, for there will be no loss of life among you, but only of the ship. For there stood by me this night an angel of the God to whom I belong and whom I serve, saying, do not be afraid, Paul. You must be brought before Caesar. And indeed, God has granted all those who sail with you. So in other words, even though they didn't listen to him, Paul said, God is going to save every single person here. And boy, was that a test of faith, because they were really in bad shape at this point. And the thing is, he said that, but he says that take heart, men, for I believe that God will be just, as it was told me. However, we must run aground on a certain island. And that was Malta. We're going to find out. They ran aground on the island of Malta. Now, this is where Paul starts leading. And he introduced to these pagans the idea that an angel visited him. I don't know how much into it a bunch of sailors would be. Can you imagine sailors? Bad language, probably knew about the gods, but do you think they really cared? If they were anything, they were superstitious probably, but I don't think they really believed in gods. They probably believed in magic and who knows what all. They were Roman sailors. These are not classy guys that are with them.
I was saying,
Soldiers.
cussing like a sailor.
Cussing like a sailor. And so, but what Paul said was this angel said that I am the reason. Now just imagine how they felt. That Paul said, I am the reason we are going to be saved. Because God has me so that I have to speak to Caesar. I don't know what they made of it, but it proved to be absolutely true. And this is another leadership thing. Look at what it says. Now, when the 14th night had come, in other words, from the time they sailed, it had been 14 days where they were being driven up and down. Now, this is a thing where it says in the Adriatic Sea. I don't want to say this is a translation. A lot of the commentators just come right out and say it's a mistranslation. Because look at where the Adriatic Sea is. If you look, the Adriatic Sea is the sea between Italy and the mainland of Europe. And Paul's boat's down here. Probably the translation that should have been used was the Adrian Sea. Because no, it ran out of there. Am I on? Okay. Should have been the Adrian Sea, because that is what is now called the Ionian Sea. This is the modern day name for it. And it extends between Greece and Italy and the boot of Italy. So this is where their boat was. They were probably being driven up and down this sea, and they didn't know where the heck they were. They had no idea. So that's where we were looking at the passage. Now, but all of a sudden the sailors sensed that they were approaching land. How do you sense that? I don't know, I'm not a sailor. But they got the idea, so they started taking soundings. You know that when you get closer to an island, the water's going to get shallower, obviously. And so they started taking soundings. And they found out that in the first sounding it was 20 fathoms, the second one was 15. This is about 120 feet. Now they're 90 feet. So they know they're approaching land. But that's not necessarily the best, because it said they feared that they would run aground on the rocks. They're in the middle of a storm and they're approaching on some kind of land. They don't know where they are, and they're afraid the boat's going to get wrecked for this. So what they did was they put anchors out in this. So if you put anchors out and you start running onto land, the anchors are hopefully going to catch the land so that the boat doesn't get rammed against the rocks. Make sense? That was their hope. And the problem is there was almost a mutiny on board at this point, because what it says is that, and you know that these sailors didn't all believe Paul, that they were going to be safe, that they took the skiff and let it down into the sea, and they were going to try to escape. There was a group of sailors on the boat that was going to try to escape in this little boat. That was just not going to work, because the storm was so bad they would have died anyway, but they were going to try to be saved. Well, what Paul said to the centurion was that unless these men stay with the boat, nobody will be saved. What difference does it make if a few people left? They needed all hands on deck. They're in the middle of a storm. If part of the crew leaves, how are they going to control the boat? See, that's the problem. Nobody was allowed to leave. And there were apparently some people who had believed Paul. Isn't this interesting that every time spirituality is brought up among people, some people believe it and some people don't. Some of the sailors didn't believe it, but some of the sailors believed Paul so much that they cut the ropes of the skiff and let it fall into the sea so that nobody could escape. Now, whether they said that was a good idea is from a sailor's point of view, there's a lot of argument about that. They need a skiff in a sailing situation like this, because they could have got to land partly with it. They didn't want anybody escaping. They cut it. So what happened was, as they went, they realized that, you know, trying to escape, what does that imply? That's what I'm trying to think. They were endangering their own lives, they were endangering the lives of the other people on the ship, and they were showing unbelief. They just didn't believe, even though Paul had been proved right. So the thing about it is, they hadn't eaten for this whole 14 days. Can you imagine? Because they were so nervous. The boat was up and down. They might have been seasick, who knows? They had all kinds of stores of food, but they had not eaten. They were just trying to survive. So what Paul said is, eat now because you are all going to be safe. Not a hair will fall from the head of any of you. So he then did something that I don't know what they made of, but he took the bread and gave thanks to God in the presence of them all. Do you think that some of these sailors might have been saved by the time they got onto Malta? How are you going to spend all this time with Paul, and you know that he preached to them? Some of these sailors got saved, you know that. And they're giving thanks, he's giving thanks to God for the bread they have, and ate. And so they all ate. And as soon as they were encouraged, they threw the rest of they had enough faith to throw the rest of the meat into the sea, because the lighter the ship, the better. They wanted to lighten the ship. So after they ate, they threw it in the sea. They knew they were approaching land. See, that's the whole point. Now, when it got to be daylight, they saw the beach. They had no idea what this place was. They had been blown off course for 14 days without navigation. Does that sound like a miracle of God? They are in the middle of the Mediterranean Sea. Look at all that water. They could have been blown anywhere. They couldn't control the ship. Where did they get blown? On an island just south of Rome. That's a miracle. There's no doubt about it. So what happened was after they got there, they tried to, this is amazing. It says in the passage, they loosened the rudder ropes so they couldn't steer. They knew they were going to lose the boat. They loosened the rudders. They put up the mainsail because the wind was blowing correctly and tried to get to shore that way, have the wind blow that way. Problem is, they ran up on the rocks, so they didn't make it. Didn't make it to the shore. And it says in the passage that the prow, the front, got stuck in the rocks and the rear of the boat was being destroyed by the waves and they couldn't move. But Paul had said they would all be saved. So how did they get to the land? The soldiers wanted to kill the prisoners because if you lost a prisoner and you were a Roman guard, you could be killed. You know that. They wanted to kill the prisoners so that they wouldn't get. But the centurion apparently really liked Paul, and he wanted to keep Paul safe. So he stopped them from killing the prisoners. And when the boat got destroyed, they all escaped safely to land. And it says that basically, if you could swim, you swam, or else on pieces of the boat it was breaking up. They could use the wood to float into shore. Every person, 276 people, made it safely. Not one loss. But the boat was gone. Is that amazing? I wouldn't even expect that even in the army. You sink a boat. Are you going to save every person? Probably not. They saved every single person. See, this is all a miracle. It doesn't come right out and say it's a miracle, but it's obviously a miracle. Now, the thing is that the island that they grounded on was called Malta, which is right south of Sicily, and Rome. You could go straight up the peninsula of Italy to get to Rome, and that's where they needed to be. And so, since this is the end of our time, I'm sure that next week we're going to talk about what happened at Malta. Paul preached there, and then they all ended up in Rome safely.